Good morning. Welcome to Where's My Midwife, a podcast. My name is Steff. I am the Director, Communications, and many other things with the Big Push for Midwives campaign. And I am joined today by my co-host, Kirsti, co-founder of Where's My Midwife, and Indra Lusero. Kirsti, please tell us more about Indra.
Indra is the founder of Elephant Circle, and they are also the president and founder of the Birth Rights Bar Association. So welcome, Indra, and take it away, Steff.
Indra, we just want to get started by asking you more about when you got started with this birth policy and justice work. What drew you to it, and when did you begin?
I mean, definitely the catalyzing event was giving birth at home. I have two kids. I didn't give birth to the oldest, but I was there in the support role. And, that was, I would say, an optimal hospital birth. And then I gave birth to our youngest and gave birth at home with what Colorado calls a direct entry midwife. So I think it was certainly the home birth experience, but also the contrast of the two that captivated me. Mainly, I was completely obsessed, fascinated, confused by how this thing that clearly was so, low resource in a way that you would think would make it easier for more people to access was vastly the minority experience in the United States. And I wanted to understand why. And of course, also from that experience, as many people experience, I learned things from my midwives about certain restrictions, certain, limitations imposed by the state, and felt how that impacted me. And I was also really curious about those. Where did they come from? What was the thinking? What was going on there? And, probably just because of the orientation of my brain and how I think about things, I ultimately decided to go to law school to answer those questions. Of course, there's a lot of ways to answer those questions, but that was one of the ways. And it was not entirely my idea. I actually had taken the day off at work. I worked at a school, K-8 elementary school at the time. And because the Midwives Alliance of North America conference was in town, it was just like 30 minutes away. So I was attending the conference and curious about law school too. So I was going to visit a law school class also in the same town. And I was feeling like, I'm so weird. Who is curious about midwifery and law school, like in the same day even? But a bunch of midwives, helped me see, actually, this is amazing. We need these two interests aligned. We need people who are interested in defending midwifery. So that was like the light bulb moment, really realizing that these could be aligned. I could answer these questions with these tools, and that, the rest is history. That was 3 years after my youngest son was born. He just turned 18 a couple of weeks ago, so it was about 15 years ago.
That's interesting. That makes it, to me, sound like you activated about the same time I did, which was 2007 for me. I'm in another state than you. I'm close, a couple over, but I had the same experience. I had a home birth, and my midwife kind of alerted me to the fact that midwives were felons in my state, punishable by up to 7 years in prison. And I couldn't even wrap my brain around that. I just couldn't even, and I knew I had to do something. I didn't go to law school. I think I had a test when I was a kid, like you could be a lawyer, and then like PR specialist was the other one, which is hilarious. And I went that route in college, and I started off as a communications support to our coalition of midwives and consumers in our state. So similar. I'm very impressed that you went to law school. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience? How was that for you?
So I was an older student. I wasn't a very old student, really, but a lot of people do go directly to law school from undergrad, and I hadn't. In fact, I had a master's. My master's is in theater. So really was doing a different thing, had gone a different direction. Yes, go humanities, yay arts. Um, but I have lawyers in my family in the way that certain professions do follow in families. And there would be points where I would consider the law, but just didn't quite see an alignment. So this moment was like where things all kind of lined up. Nonetheless, I definitely had people in my life who knew me more as the artist me, who were concerned, worried, that law school would kind of, you know, tamp out the creative. And I think that is a risk. I'm glad I was warned and had considered that. I certainly came into the law school experience very prepared, um, expecting it to be hard in a way, not just like rigor or academically hard, but sort of soul crushing. um, Interestingly, and maybe because I was prepared, I did not find it to be soul crushing. Certainly, there's a lot of parts of learning about the law that is soul crushing. I mean, it is you just starting from colonization, just the premise of even this country's legal system is soul crushing, horrible. But there were enough professors who actually brought that view, who acknowledged that. I had a torts professor who said the law is never neutral. And there were enough of those touchstones that I actually found it very compelling, um, you know, important, clarifying. I learned the kinds of things I wanted to learn. I wanted to know more about how systems worked on that level. So, and I because I went in with this with this clear vision, I literally had a file from one of the midwives I knew, from one of her, one of the discipline actions that so many midwives we know face. And that was that was on my desk, just I wanted to understand how that could go, how her case could go the way it did. And it was one of those typical midwife discipline cases where it was like she did nothing wrong. The rules were clear. She followed the rules, and yet she ultimately was required to do some crazy discipline thing. And so even, of course, law school doesn't teach you anything about these things. There is no such thing as taking classes about midwifery in law school. There's no childbirth in the law classes. So it was all self-taught along the way. But I think that's what made the legal education like really alive for me, was pursuing answers to questions that I had.
If I can say, and this may be too bold, but I feel like you, Indra, are a pioneer. You're going into law and you're bringing your experiences, your perceptions, your love of midwifery and the care that represents, and you're forging a new path. I feel like that's what the Birthrights Bar Association does as well. And back to that phrase of soul crushing, I just kind of get tingly because that's exactly why I got engaged as well. I felt like the advocates the grassroots activists in the states, whether they be midwives or, families, were just running into the fan blade every time they went to the legislators, every time they went to the state capitals to ask for something very fair, very just, very healthy, very correct. And I couldn't believe that that would happen to them. And they would go and they would be so naive. They would think, we'll just go and we'll just show them the evidence. We'll just communicate these talking points about how good this kind of care is for us and for our community. And that wasn't what it was about. And so that power distortion really drove me into this in a way that I can't even fully comprehend to this day. But I just know that we're not going to let this go by unchallenged. We're not going to not lend support, whether it's communications or legal or a million other things that are required to do this work. So I applaud you for following your heart and for getting into this work. I have a few slides that I created based on some topics that you mentioned you might want to discuss. So if that's okay, guys, I'm just going to pull it up on the screen and we'll kind of just go through some of these key points and talk more about this work and your role in it. Indra, thank you again for being here with us today. So I'm going to hit play. Where's my midwife? A podcast. We're just so excited. So you are a JD and an MA. I kind of like, Indra, I'm a little bit of a fan over here. This is pretty cool stuff. So I just pulled a couple items. If we were going to entitle our conversation, thinking outside the scope of practice box, supporting bold policy solutions, and funding birth justice policy work. That is a mouthful, but that really is what your work is all about. If I could just say, I'm very glad you're here with us today. There you are, smiley. Now, were you on stage when this photo was taken? Because that's a fancy looking vest. I like that.
Yeah, you do have it's.
And you're lit immaculately, I must say.
It wasn't on stage, but it was a photo shoot. So there was that sort of energy.
So one of the hats you wear is the elephant circle. Can you please share more with our listeners about this project, this effort?
So Elephant Circle was founded while I was in the middle of law school. It was really clear before I even went to law school that there wasn't going to be a job on the other side of law school that would allow me to do what I wanted to do with a JD. So I knew I was going to have to forge a path. And I just decided to start well before I was even done with law school. And it's really inspired by the reproductive justice model of work, which is very intersectional. It's very rooted in an anti-racist approach. And as a queer Latinx person, really resonated with me as the kind of approach that we needed with regard to birth. But I had already, by that point, been involved in reproductive justice work and saw how, there were no conversations about birth happening within reproductive justice organizations. So I knew there needed to be something to kind of be that bridge. So Elephant Circle was founded, and actually we were fiscally sponsored for 8 years by the Colorado Organization for Latina Opportunity and Reproductive Rights, which is a reproductive justice organization. And so really working with Color was one of my early efforts to do what I think Elephant Circle does, is build the capacity of reproductive justice organizations to talk about, to be a part of birth related conversations, to move into birth justice spaces. So So that's Elephant Circle in a nutshell. I guess I'll also say that the reason it's called Elephant Circle is really just because of being inspired by how elephants give birth in the wild. When elephants birth, the herd circles around the laboring elephant. And elephants labor like humans, so their labors can be shorter, they can be longer. And I saw a video of elephants laboring, and the circle of elephants were so clearly connected and moved and part of the experience that the laboring elephant was having. And I thought that's what humans need. We need a circle around us when we're laboring, a circle that's really supportive, inward facing, connected, attuned, but then also this circle of defense. I mean, a circle of elephants, I think, is just an incredible metaphor of protection and defense. If you think about what's inside a circle of elephants, like there's no who could breach that. So that's the vision of Elephant Circle, that we all have a circle of support during the perinatal period.
Wow, wow, wow.
I love that.
Cheers to that.
No doubt. And
Let's make that a reality.
what's interesting too, that circle, I did not know that about elephants. I may have heard that years ago, but it certainly didn't stick in my head at all. When the big push for midwives got started, and we recognized that there were all of these people who were activating in every state, it felt to us like by themselves, they would be very alone, having to learn everything from the beginning, from the ground up, from scratch, so to speak. And we felt like that was not so efficient. Why not sort of create a big circle around all of the organizations, all of the midwifery associations, and all of the consumer, friends of Missouri midwives, and so on, and draw a circle around all of them. I think I maybe even use the word ribbon, a big ribbon around them all to show, the big push for midwives. This is not just one state, and to learn from one another. And that's where our power comes from, I think, too, is that ability to share and learn and protect and defend, because it is a fight. And that was surprising to me. And I don't know, Kirsti, don't you think this is something surprisingly violent, and it's a fight? We're fighting against
Absolutely.
opponents that were so surprising to me. So I'll hush and get your thoughts on that.
Well, I feel like absolutely that was, and Indra, back to what you said about, coming from a theater, or like for me, I came from a theater and film background, and it just seemed like such a natural segue to go from thinking about humanity in that way, being expressive about, the ups and downs and trials and tribulations of humanity in the arts, and then putting that into action with advocacy. It's just such a seamless transition. So many people, I feel like, get their start in theater and film and end up being advocates for this, that, or the other thing. And I think I absolutely was surprised. I had a similar story where, gave birth at home, and then I had to transport with my eldest to the hospital and had to pretend that my midwife was a doula, because they're not licensed in the state of North Carolina. So the whole thing was shocking to me. And she had told me that she wasn't licensed, but I had no idea what that meant. And I think that's part of the reason I'm glad that there's the Elephant Circle and other advocacy groups, because part of what we have to do is educate the public about not only how awesome midwives are, but all of these obstacles that are in the way to even find out about midwifery care. And so, yeah, it was, to me, it seemed very violent. Like it seemed like this peaceful process I was trying to have was removed from me, and I was drug tested without my knowledge, and it was not fun. And it could have been a beautiful, seamless transition from the midwife handing off my paperwork to the people there, and it was not that. And so that's really what got me fired up. And then, just finding out that people were being arrested for giving women the kind of care that they were asking for. That just seemed insane to me. So yeah, I completely 100% agree. And I love that you went to law school and founded a nonprofit like at the same time, and you had children. I am just in awe of you. That's
True.
superwoman stuff for
I
real.
I did
Yeah.
have small children, although I was co-parenting gratefully um, with multiple folks, so had more support than average. But I think actually I wasn't surprised, and I think that's part of what informs Elephant Circle's approach. Um, I have found that for some people, their experience with midwifery and birth is their, for some people, their first experience with the kinds of injustices that are really baked into the system.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, my queer Latinx view and life experience was such that by the time that I was having kids, I was just utterly, deeply, completely aware of so many injustices. I mean, just formatively, the year that I came out was the same year that Colorado passed its famous anti-gay uh, ballot measure.
Wow.
And you know, it felt like the same sort of audacious injustice as midwives being punished feels, as restraints on, you know, like stuff you were talking about when you just try to earnestly make your case at the Capitol, and it's astonishing that the response is, you know, devastation. And that's really how this ballot measure felt. Like, this is not a complicated thing. I'm a human being. I should have dignity in how I experience the world. And
Yeah.
basically more than half of Colorado voters said nah. And that case actually went to the US Supreme Court, and it was found to be unconstitutional by the time I graduated from college. And that was kind of like my coming
Wow.
out and my sort of blossoming as a queer person.
Wow. Wow.
When I was actually pregnant, before I had gotten pregnant, I was deeply interested in and reading about the Zapatistas, who are people in southern Mexico, indigenous, whose land has been really taken over by big corporations. And I was very interested because they had done this amazing job in the early 90s of bringing international attention to their plight. This tiny, tiny group of folks with not a lot of resources and with huge, massive resources against them. I mean, like, the power imbalance couldn't be more stark. And yet they defended themselves, and they got others to know about what was happening to them. And, you know, this is pre-Google. And that's, to me, when I discovered, when I had a home birth, I felt like that, I felt a direct link to that kind of struggle. That one of the amazing things about giving birth physiologically is that it has that kind of power. It has the kind of power of a tiny movement against huge odds, you know. It's so
Absolutely.
resourcing. And that's part of what excited me about it. Like, the power, the energy of this could be transformational, because it doesn't require any special tools. It's not expensive.
Right.
And yet it's quite challenging.
That's right.
True story.
So back to something you said, Kirsti, about, the handoff idea, the idea of being able to labor at home, maybe even birth at home, and then to be able to transfer seamlessly for any follow-up care
Mhm.
that might be required. That's something that the Big Push for Midwives has been talking about a lot since probably 2019, 2020. The idea that there's a reproductive, maternal, child health continuum of care.
Right.
And so I think that may be a good segue into our next main area of focus, which is thinking outside of the scope of practice box. There are so many providers that we are becoming, as a society, more aware of. They include doulas, they include midwives. Of course, we've always, well, not always, but we've recently, in the last few hundred years, we've had obstetricians, the surgeons. So it's important for the US specifically to think about what are our providers. We clearly have a dearth, a lack of maternity care going on. You have so many counties where there are maternity care deserts. So to be able to identify who is here, this sort of that ABDC, let me say again, ABCD approach to community development, so asset-based community development. This could be translated to maternity care. Who are the assets in our community? What are the assets in our community that could provide for women and people who want this kind of care, whether they're, like I said, a midwife or a doula. So, but Indra, I think you had something else specifically to say about this. So I just wanted to give that as a jumping off point.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a recent history of fighting for midwives' scope of practice, fighting for midwives to be included in that list of providers that are, officially recognized by the state. And we've learned some things about that fight. Number one, that it is a fight. And I think when I'm talking about thinking outside of the scope of practice box, that's that fight, the scope of practice box. And just as a strategy for winning the war, I think we need to rethink that battle. So one of the things we are attempting here in Colorado this legislative session, when we have a sunset of the midwifery law, so we're in the middle of a scope of practice fight, simultaneously we are bringing 2 additional bills that we're referring to all 3 of these as a birth equity bill package. So the other 2 bills that are not in this scope of practice box are really ambitious at a scale that folks who know how hard the scope of practice fight is, would appreciate is just dauntingly ambitious. But I think we'll see how it goes. I will report back.
We'd love that.
Part of the thinking is that we really just need to change the terms of the conversation. Since essentially the profession of medicine has set the terms of the scope of practice fight. And that's just literal. They literally crafted what scope of practice even means. It was in the hands of the doctors. So it's hard to win a fight on somebody else's terms. So we need to change the terms, because there are terms that are our terms. And those terms are how people who give birth are experiencing the context of their giving birth, what their options are, how it feels, how they're being treated when they're transferred, how they're being treated if they have some change during the process. And it's not good. It's
nope
bad.
Yep.
So, and you know, a layer of the bad is racism. A layer of the bad is the way that we have these inequities that are literally unconscionable. How can we live with ourselves when it's so not fair, you know? And anyway, so if we change the terms of the conversation to be on our terms, this is what we want to talk about. This is what we value. I think we might be able to make more progress on more of the pieces that impact how we experience care, and even how people then experience the profession, whether it be of obstetrics or of midwifery. I think providers are unhappy with how this system works, even though some of them are defending the status quo rigorously, absurdly, I think, in some instances.
Yep.
But so there are transfer provisions in this bill package that would require all licensed facilities to have a policy following best practices for transfers from community birth. That would require providers, all providers who provide care for labor and delivery, to use best practices for transfer and interprofessional collaboration. There are prohibitions against malpractice insurance companies having policies that exclude VBAC. There are provisions that would create a new tracking system for reporting disrespect and mistreatment during birth. So it's multidimensional.
Wow. You are incredible. That is everything.
Yeah.
Like literally, that is everything.
Well, and we actually envision this as phase one.
Wow.
Because there's even more exciting things. And this phase one was designed with this current moment in mind, the kind of budget constraints in this COVID reality. But I'd love to see some really strategic innovation projects, some creative ways of leveraging incentives, some maybe tax rebates for just all kinds of things, some better workforce development, targeting certain schools to create midwifery programs. Colorado doesn't have any CPM training programs in state, all kinds of things.
Wow. This gives me hope.
Well, it really is cutting edge, leading edge, Indra. So thank you for this work and for bringing it to our attention. These are bold policy solutions. And my hope is that when you go to the legislature in Colorado, that the State Medical Society will stand down, because we know that it is actually less about some of the practitioners and the providers, the individual obstetricians and gynecologists. It's actually their trade association. So ACOG, American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and their policy arm, the American Congress, rather, American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, who are passing the scope of practice partnership policies that basically say, not only are we going to restrict the scope of practice of other providers, and not just midwives, but really, any kind of other providers that are not surgeons, but we're going to seek them out. We're going to map them. We're going to try to restrict their practice. So those policies and those behind the scenes, the marionette strings that are somehow enforced by the state medical societies and again, a violent way. We have stories in Missouri of the state medical society representative physically pushing legislators back into their offices so they will not come to the floor to vote on a bill that we had years ago. So it's not pretty. It's actually very violent, and the reasons behind it seem to be based on anti-competition, maintaining the power, keeping things the way they are in the status quo. So I applaud you for everything you're doing, for shining a light on what's not happening and what needs to happen. And I really hope that these bold policy solutions can be instituted and adopted in your state, because frankly, it could be the beginning of a turn, of a wave across the US, is my hope. I jumped ahead a little bit on this slide, but you mentioned training. We had the opportunity to provide comments on the Momnibus, bundle of, I think it's 13 bills in Congress. And what's interesting is they did have a workforce development bill, but it didn't have funding for schools of midwifery. It only had them for schools of nursing, as well as sort of like other, non-midwifery schools. So we went ahead and just tried to do our best to write a whole other section of that bill for suggestion to get that to be included, because workforce development is key. I don't know what you guys think, but I've noticed, obviously, with the pandemic and all of the institutional racism that women find in the hospitals, it's really created a perfect storm where women are seeking midwives in increasing numbers. Many of the midwives that we know are so busy, they can't even take any more patients on. And so that shows you the supply and demand distortion that's not quite right. But without that workforce training, you're going to have this huge demand and insufficient numbers of midwives. So I love that you're also looking at training of CPMs in your state. And we know that those are the midwives who are specifically trained as a point of their credential in out-of-hospital birth.
It also, at this point, it feels, it's always been just utterly irresponsible that the medical lobby's position is to be anti-midwife. It is opposite of what serves the best interests of families. But it feels additionally irresponsible in this moment when we're facing the kinds of climate change consequences that we are facing. It is, to me, utterly irrational that we would keep investing in high technology, high energy cost modes of giving birth and not investing in the modes, the models, the tools, the resources, the professionals who can support laboring without technology, like without using oil, without using coal. Just at the base level, it just is audacious in this moment to me. It feels, of course, but it's audacious that we have been so unresponsive to our climate situation. And this just strikes me as part of the profound irresponsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
It's so surprising how non-evidence-based the U.S. maternity care system is. It's like anti-evidence,
Anti-science.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, in addition to saving on the resources, like just the literal dollar amounts, if you don't have the care of a midwife, you're more likely to have an early baby, a low weight baby. And there's all kinds of additional costs and health complications that go with that.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't you want to go with the providers that have better outcomes, safer, healthier, less expensive? So it is irrational. And that's why the phrase distortion always comes to me. This is a market that is completely distorted. And it bothers me so much when news, journalists, because that's part of what I do, is track who's writing about these topics, when they sort of want to put it back on the women or the people who are pregnant. And they're saying, well, it must be because this particular group of pregnant people are obese, or they're not really taking care of themselves. And I thought to myself, if you had a midwife, you would be learning how to take care of yourself. You would have more time with each appointment. You both know all of this, but it's difficult to understand the many forms of opposition to this work. It's really hard to wrap your brain around it for people like us who are logical evidence, we're interested in the evidence and what's really going on. So, Indra, talk to us a little bit more about the opposition that people are facing, including racism.
Well, I was just thinking about this, because we are in a moment where more people are coming to this issue of birth equity inspired by the inequities and not coming into it with knowledge or experience about midwifery. So at first glance, for those folks, it may not be obvious the way midwifery can be an important part of the solution of racism, which is not, I must emphasize, to say that midwives aren't racist. They are, but let me explain how these pieces kind of come together. So, for example, you may have a wonderful, lovely provider who, and maybe even it's culturally congruent. Maybe the patient is a Black woman and maybe the provider is a Black woman as well. And this provider, based on her training, gently and quite thoughtfully advises her patient using a VBAC calculator what her chances of VBAC may be. And based on the calculator, she lovingly suggests that it might not be that likely for her patient to actually have a vaginal birth after her previous C-section. And so, based on that information so graciously provided, this woman may think, okay, it sounds like I should probably have another cesarean planned, whatever the sort of clinical recommendations that flow from, you don't have a great chance of a vaginal birth after cesarean. What's happening in terms of racism in this dynamic is not interpersonal. It's not between these two people. It's in the tool. This VBAC calculator was actually built in such a way that it systemically miscalculates risk using racist measurements, essentially. And that's part of the complexity of this opposition and how racism is factoring into the system today. Midwifery is a response to that because, number one, just the training of a midwifery provider will not be to use something like a VBAC calculator. So the way that technology can be racist, and then those who are using that technology are sort of deploying racism, is less of a risk in the model of midwifery care because it's less technological. So this, the sort of tools then of midwifery are education and are listening. And I think those tools are essentially less corruptible by racism. They are still corruptible, certainly, but I just less so. And so that's one of the places where we need to be thinking outside of racism as an interpersonal thing and understanding how racism is baked in systematically in all these ways. How can we get out of that? Well, we have to, by getting out of it, like we actually have to then not just do more implicit bias trainings within hospitals or among medical providers, because that's then we're still in the same, box. I think, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, working in the mental health profession, you see that so much there too. And I think that the way midwifery care bridges that divide, like understanding that it's the human that you're dealing with is not just a body that you need to get a baby out of, which seems to be the medical approach, that there are emotional factors and psychological factors and trauma because of systemic racism, how that impacts the body. The body keeps the score. I mean, it's a fact, with the ACEs study and all of that. And I feel like that, for me, if we could make all of healthcare come together. You know, it just seems to me that birth is sort of, and I saw this before when I was an activist, that birth is sort of um, it's like if we could look at birth and then understand that it is exemplary for what happens in all of healthcare, that things are compartmentalized. Like you said, you're trained in this box. And so the person is this part of that box, and you're not looking at the whole picture. And I think that's why midwifery care is, for me, it's such a model for all of healthcare, that you have to treat the person holistically. And just for me, seeing how now that I've moved into mental health care, that so much of what needs to be changed is that perspective, a shift in perspective, that you can't deal with a human as a compartment. You can't deal with them in that little box. And that's what's causing all of these problems. So yeah, like I love that there's policy happening around shifting it to the patient's perspective, instead of how do we as a culture support the providers and protect them? How do we make the experience more human?
Exactly. That too is just part of how medicine operates in a way that makes the effects of racism particularly dangerous. That
Yes.
the compartmentalizing, I mean, literally we see the effects of that. Inequities in maternal mortality. Like,
Yep.
what do you get when you don't look at the whole? As systematically don't look at the whole, you miss things. You just miss
Lots.
things.
Right.
And the consequences are dire. So let's try something else.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I don't want us to not talk about too the unfortunate reality that something I have learned in all these years of activism is that the hospitals really need there to be things to be done to you as a pregnant person.
Mm.
They don't get to charge or, write down the little code on the insurance form, whether that be private or public insurance, unless they do something. So it's not okay just to let you lie there or stand there and labor and birth without any of the things, because they don't get to charge for that, and they need to charge for that. We know that the hospital systems can earn as much as 50% or more of their revenues from their maternity units, if you will. So there isn't a lot of impetus for them if they're interested in a sort of a for-profit model, which so many hospitals are these days. They absolutely wish to do things to people, whatever the case may be. Strip your membranes, put in the IV, add the epidural into the mix, get the Pitocin going, and on and on and on, the medical cascade. And then, of course, we have the outcomes that are not so hot as a result. So this lack of information among pregnant people, I feel like, is used against them. Also, we know how vulnerable you are. One is when laboring and birthing. It's very difficult to push back against that insistence that we need to do this. We got to do this. If you don't do this, it's going to be bad. And that pressure that happens, obviously, because obstetricians are trained to think of pregnancy and birth as everything that can go wrong versus just a normal physiological function of the body. But and it is becoming more evident. I feel like people go through a bad birth in a hospital and they have all these things done to them, and it's not the experience they want. And then they want something different. And then they do pursue that education and that information so that they cannot be oppressed. But I hope that we can do more before they even get pregnant, so that they can find a way and advocate for themselves, empowered with this information that is so important to have.
That's honestly why I left activism and got a degree in social work, because I realized that we need to be educating our youth about we need comprehensive birth and sex education. It all needs to be tied together, again, with the compartmentalization, again, with another institution education that is, it's like, we need to check these boxes. We need to get these kids to the next level. We need, instead of actually teaching them things. And it's super frustrating that we're not. And I don't know, it is education, like educating the youth, part of the legislation that you're writing, Indra?
Not in this phase one. I've been an educator. I highly value that. And I think in this moment, I feel like there are some structural barriers that have to be removed.
Mm.
That education alone can't tackle the complexity of the problem.
Absolutely.
I think I'm motivated to sort of complement the power that education can be with removing some barriers. I guess
Yeah.
it's been partly because it's just been so heartbreaking for 15 years to have to be a person who tells people, no, there's literally no option and there's no pathway for accountability. And there is this huge barrier there. So basically, I'm part of educating people about things that are true. It's just terribly depressing things.
Oh my
Yes.
goodness.
Like, seriously, why?
if I-
Part of the reason why I had to take a break and get away
Yeah.
from it, because
Yeah.
it was so frustrating and so, like you said, heartbreaking to see people just don't know. And then when I would interview people about, I was trying to do interviews for North Carolina Friends and Midwives about why people chose home birth. And this was back with mini DV tapes, way back in the day. And I would have a hour-long tape, and 45 minutes of the interview would be the couple talking about their train wreck of a birth in the hospital. And then the last 15 minutes would be how glorious their home birth was. And I was like, this is great, but wow, the fact that you had to process through this for 45 minutes with me before you could even get to, that's why they chose home birth. It was just devastating.
Yeah. And it's multi-generational. My mom had my two youngest siblings at home
Mm-hmm.
after her second birth was miserable in the hospital. And so I got, in the second generation, I got to take up some of the learning that she forged, because that's how long these sorts of things take, which is why I think your instinct to start with educating youth is so compelling. But I know that right now, even if we were educating youth as well as we should be, they would then be reproducing people who would encounter these walls. And to some extent, there is some truth to the, ignorance is bliss. Like, there is a way where the trauma of these systems is particularly acute when you see it and can't do anything about it.
Right.
Knowing without having whatever peculiar power it takes to not be harmed by these blades. I'm very captivated by the way you described it as blades that people would.
So actually, it's funny that you're saying that, because I was just like bursting out of my heart to share this. Mama Hakima Tafanzi Payne is here in my city. And she was an early activist that I was able to connect with as I sort of turned on to all of this. And her early career was as a nurse, labor and delivery. And from what I understand, from the conversations that I had with her years ago, she said she was the one that introduced me to that phrase. She said, you know what? I educate all these young ladies. I tell them what they need to know. I tell them what not to allow to be done to them. And then they go to the hospital and it's worse, because it is like going into the blades of a fan. And that stuck with me, because I'm like, yeah, so you've empowered them and they think they can advocate and fight for the birth that they want. But the system is so strong, such a vice grip, that there's no way especially while laboring and birthing, because again, so vulnerable, so susceptible to the circle around you. And if that circle is effectively a vice grip or a fan blade, then you are so screwed. And that is like the soul crushing, heartbreaking part of all of this, because you're right, it is not enough to educate unless we can also simultaneously change the status quo, so that when you get there and you advocate for yourself, you're heard, you're responded to, and you get to have the kind of birth that you know is possible. It's a very, again, distorted, jacked up system, and it's so hard. And she now, I can't wait, Kirsti, for us to bring her to Where's My Midwife podcast. She actually is like, you know what, I'm out. I'm going to just go create a whole other system. I'm going to train doulas. I'm going to train midwives.
That's what has to happen. I completely agree with that. I feel like the system is broken, and I spent 10 years trying to fix it and was like, I'm beating my head against a wall. I can't do this anymore, because I was making myself unhealthy. And so now stepping back and looking at it, I'm like, well, it's already broken. Let's just build the birth and wellness centers that we need and create something. And people will leave that sinking ship in droves and come over to this place that we want to build, these community centers that are run by midwives and social workers. I feel like we need that social justice component. We need mental health. And I feel like if we had these community centers that were, run by midwives and social workers, oh my God, I just feel like people would leave that system and come on over. And I think I love what Sherry's doing. I really do. And yeah, I can't wait to talk to her about it. That's awesome.
Yeah. It's actually, I wrote this blog post about how lack of information is a weapon of oppression. To be about the flip side, not the ones who lack the information, and how that is also a weapon of oppression, but how people in decision-making positions who claim they lack information is also used as a weapon of oppression, because that's something I'm currently encountering with these bills that I'm working on here in Colorado. And I think it's all in relationship, these ways that lack of information are come together. But I think we need to, at this point, cut through any of this use of lack of information as an excuse for not making policy changes. And it is used as an excuse. I mean, especially with regard to midwifery. Well, we don't have enough information about it. We should study it. We should do another study. No, nope. There is at this point, we do not lack any information about which we could make smart policy decisions. We don't need another study. We do not. And people who use that excuse, we need to just say it's unacceptable. You cannot be in a policy-making position if you lack information on this subject. You should not be there. You have enough information.
Word.
And some of the information, like you're saying, Kirsti, is that people know what is good. Like it's actually not that complicated. We feel it. We don't need studies. It is knowable in our bodies, the difference between being honored and being in a fan blade. It just
and I think that's part of, to me, that's the epitome of the shift, is this idea that for so long, all of our institutions are based on the authority being out there somewhere, someone telling you what to do and being like, okay, I'll just lay here if that's what I'm supposed to do. And then lo and behold, it's a terrible experience. And sure, I have a healthy baby, but I feel like crap. What just happened? That we know in our physical self, and learning to trust that is the shift that we're making as a humanity. Like we're shifting away from the authority being out there somewhere to, okay, I need to check in with myself. And really see, how am I having this experience? Where's the power with me? How am I going to give birth to my child? And to me, that was always the weird dichotomy between the medical model and the midwifery model was, with a physician, they're trained to deliver a baby from a woman. They have the power. And with midwives, it's how can I help to support you as you give birth to your baby? The power stays with the mom. And I just, that subtle difference is to me what makes, like, it's night and day. And that's, I feel like, the shift that everybody needs to make. How do we put the moms back at the center of the care? And don't legislate to me how I give birth. I mean, it just, yeah.
Yeah, it's so shocking to me. I don't know if I said it, but obviously ACOG is a trade association. So again, the trade association gets to set the policy for how all of this care is being delivered. And again, I heard the other day that the nurse midwives who have been in the hospital system since the 70s, they basically, threw themselves under the bus to get in there, and they were, willing to allow the physicians to be their overseers. And they're finally in 2021 saying, you know what, we're done with that collaborative practice requirement. Again, I said it in a previous podcast, but what profession gets to oversee another one? Electricians don't oversee plumbers. Plumbers don't oversee mechanics. It's just ridiculous that is the power structure in this country. Who the heck died and left the docs in charge of everyone and
Well,
everything? It makes me really mad. You can tell that.
Well, and part of what made me crazy too was talking to the nurse midwives who I swear most of them had, like, what's it called? When you relate to your captor, what's that syndrome called?
Yes, I know what
Yes.
you're talking about.
It was like they would stand up for them when
Oh, yeah.
when I remember making my first speech in front of people at Kim's, like, we need to be in the streets about this. This is insane that you were being treated this way, to the midwives. And this one woman stood up in the back and she was like, but my doctor is so nice. He doesn't realize what he's doing. And I was like, whoa, this is like domestic violence happening right now. And the fact that so many of them, they're just grateful to have a job. And so they don't want to rock the boat, and they'll allow themselves to be mistreated. And that was really hard to watch.
Oh, it is. That's another reason why I really want to get out of the scope of practice box. I think it's particularly damaging between nurse midwives and professional midwives. The ways that the nurse midwives are bought into this scope of practice thing, for the ways that it is in the short term an advantage to them over professional midwives, but not in the long term. In the long term, that trade-off has meant that actually nurse midwives have independent practice in less states than professional midwives. But, I've encountered that here in Colorado, that commitment to a structure that is self-defeating. But, I'm just watching it unfold.
Well, and it benefits the physicians. That was one of the things I noticed too, was that they intentionally pit them against each other, because if they were to turn around, I tried to use the clip from Bug's Life where they all realized that they outnumber the grasshoppers. And I'm like, the midwives need to be like coming together and standing up to the physicians. And it was just, the physicians knew how to keep them playing against each other, because then they're fighting for like scraps of power, and instead of just being like, you know what, we got this. You guys do surgery. We're going to do normal birth.
Yeah. It's back to that whole, like, the pinball table is tilted, for sure. And it's because of the policy that they so fiercely reserve as their own in the state houses. I want to shift a bit now to Birthrights Bar Association. Indra, I missed what you said about when that was founded, but I've been deeply impressed with the efforts of the association and the attorneys who are involved and how they serve.
So, yeah, I founded Birthrights Bar Association after graduating from law school. So, Elephant Circle had already been going for 5 years or so. But it really came out of similar organizing as the big push. Like, let's actually figure out who we are and where we are, and, wrap a ribbon around us so that we're less alone. Because there were a handful of lawyers who cared about these issues and saw them, but we would get inquiries the kinds of inquiries that I think the big push would get to, trying to problem solve in a specific state. And we wouldn't even really know, do we have a lawyer in that state? Do we know anybody? So it really, the goal was just to get a handle on where we were, what we knew. And as it turns out, there just weren't very many of us. And the places that we would get inquiries were not places that we had lawyers. So clearly we needed more lawyers in more places. So the hope with Birthrights Bar Association is that we can grow that community of lawyers who care about these issues, who are skillful with regard to these issues, and who can help each other be more skillful and really grow the area of the law. So we focus on that. Definitely encourage a lot of law students to become members for that reason, to kind of get in the pipeline. And then we do education that's targeted to lawyers or legal advocates about a range of issues that we see as being important to skillfully be a specialist in childbirth and the law. So we actually have our third conference coming up in April, which I'm really excited about. In a way, it's the kind of programming and education that I wish I could have had delivered to me in law school, but that, I and lawyers of my generation and previous generations, we just had to figure out on our own. We're starting to bring it, systematically bring it to people. I'm super excited.
So
That is so cool.
Where can folks go to learn how to participate in that? And when it's in April, so it's fast.
April 16th and 17th. It is virtual this year, so really accessible. I think our costs are quite accessible. Birthrightsbar.org. And it's pretty clear from there. You can see the schedule, register.
How many members do you have now?
I haven't checked probably in a few months, but we were hovering around 100.
Nice. That's awesome.
It's incredible.
Yeah. Growing slowly but surely, but growing. And a good number of members who are law students. Actually, we have kind of a cohort that's graduating this spring. I'm really excited about. I'm hoping.
It's lovely. I wanted to share too, you mentioned something, Defense of Midwives. This is as a paper, a document of some kind?
Yeah, we are about to issue what we see as our first installment of this document. We're wanting to write a resource that lawyers all over could use that will just distill in one place key learnings about defending midwives. Because we're still in this situation where we don't have enough lawyers in enough places that can be skillful, a lot of times people are going to be in a position of defending midwives without a lot of background knowledge or expertise. So we're hoping that this is the kind of document that even midwives could know about, and then the midwives could take it to their lawyers who aren't as practiced in these issues, and just, maybe learn some of the key things, avoid some of the common pitfalls.
Kind of like a primer.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful to really set them off with a strong foundation of all of the main key topics and issues to be aware of, maybe.
Yeah. And then we'll also have Saraswati Vedam will be giving our keynote at the conference. So she'll really help set the stage in talking about how midwifery is linked to the need for more accountability, which is linked to improving people's experiences of birth. And then that will set us up well for, we have like an hour and a half session focusing on defensive midwives. So we'll get to have that sort of conversation collectively as lawyers and legal advocates. What can we do to better defend midwives?
So all of this, I'm guessing, is funded in part, but maybe not sufficiently.
uh I would say it's not even funded.
Mm.
Not only is it not funded sufficiently, but it's just really not funded. Fortunately, like, Elephant Circle has started to get more funding to where I can give my full attention to it, but the parts that are being funded are not these policy parts.
Mm.
And certainly where we see the need for basically people to be paid for their time is just not being funded. And to be fair, it is that people don't understand. We need to keep making the case. We need to keep showing how these things are connected, that people's experience of care is informed by policy. Because of course, I think the first layer of thinking is the care providers. Let's fund the care, and that's good. There's more funding for doulas, programs that do doula work, that kind of thing. But people don't see yet. It just takes another layer to see how. But we also actually have to fund people who think about how the systems are put together.
Yeah, I at the beginning of our conversation today, Indra, you mentioned about the reproductive justice movement, and I have always been flabbergasted by how that has not included birth. I just can't even understand it. I don't understand why reproductive justice only means abortion. I mean, just from a numbers perspective, I think it's something like 24% of pregnant people will have an abortion, and maybe 77% will carry a pregnancy to term and give birth. So just from a numbers perspective, we're talking about a larger population that are affected by the issues of birth. So how can reproductive justice not include it? And certainly, why do these foundations that say they're all about that just ignore birth? Who cares about birth is sort of my next t-shirt, I think. March of Dimes, I guess, birth effects. But to your point, in policy, the crucible within which we birth in the United States, who the heck cares about that? And I think you've got some new foundations that are coming along. Groundswell Fund, I know, does some pretty impactful work. Maybe Robert Wood Johnson's kind of almost there. Maybe MacArthur Foundation. I will tell you, I have been searching for years to understand who funds this work.
Yeah.
Who would pay Indra Lusero to work full time? Who would pay Kirsti Kreutzer and Steff Hedenkamp to work full time? It's tough. It's depressing, to be honest.
It really is. It really is. And I have to just give a shout out to both of you for the work that you've done underfundedly. I think
Non-fundedly.
Yeah, exactly. Non-fundedly, it's incredibly amazing the things that we can do with no resources. I wish more funders would look at that and then imagine what we could do with funding. Even a little bit of funding, we could do a heck of a lot, because look what we do with none. I do hope that this is starting to shift. But I think what we see in reproductive justice movement funding is actually a similar problem to this staying in the scope of practice box. It is undoubtedly, there is ongoing attacks on abortion rights. And so it's that same idea that, well, let's just keep pounding away. But sometimes the better strategy is to pull back a minute, step back, see if we can look at this from another angle. And that's I think utterly what needs to happen in reproductive justice funding as well. We are not exactly succeeding with regard to abortion rights. So the, like pounding at it method, I think, is worthy of changing. We're not, we're certainly being traumatized by the scope of practice pounding. Let's see if we can approach this a little differently and be creative.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like, again, with education, I mean, if you're going to tell people that they can't have access to abortion, then let's talk about having access to birth control and education about our bodies and the way that they work and how to safely have sex and not make a baby. I mean, where's all of that in the conversation?
Or if your policy position is that you want every single pregnancy to go to term, then I would think that it would make sense that there should be massive investment in educating people about
birth
birth
and pregnancy. Hello. And I think the other thing, like, again, with this shift in humanity, becoming aware of the fact that sure, not everybody gives birth, but everybody spent some time inside of a woman growing. And so every one of us was impacted by maternity care. Every single human that is on the earth, there's no exceptions to that. So why are we not talking about that? Because it really does affect all of us. Even if you don't choose yourself to give birth or have a partner who gives birth, we were all born. Everyone's born.
we were
So
all born. And I have to just say, to shout out to the people who gestate humans who aren't women.
yes.
And one of the values, and this is in general why I think it's very important to always look to the margins, look to the voices that aren't being heard, the experiences that are even marginal, the experiences that are less common, because those experiences can help us see things that can help us get out of the box, whatever box it may be. It's just a good practice, I think, to always, gosh, what am I missing? What view does somebody else have that I could learn something from?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm, as a communications professional, a lot of my work has been, believe it or not, in capital infrastructure. So really large projects. And it's so interesting that so many engineers, they are really skeptical of this notion of stakeholder engagement. And then when you show them the cost savings in terms of the schedule, things go faster, you have buy-in, you don't have changes later, just the bottom line, it moves them. It's like the neck turning the head, if you will. And it's the same here. If we would just listen to, as you were saying, Indra, the people on the margins, or even the people in the middle of the lane, like just listen to what we're saying, man. And we could really create something special in the United States. But as it is now, we're just locked into a box with a fan blade, and it's really ridiculous. And so that's what Where's My Midwife, a podcast, is all about. That's why Kirsti and I decided to start telling the stories and interviewing the pioneers like yourself, Indra, who are doing this work with no funding and very few resources. But just because it's the thing to do, it has to be done. And if we set this work down, then who will pick it up? And I haven't been able to answer that in my tired moments when I'm like, why do I keep doing this for free? I'm not really sure. But again, how could I not do this? How could I not support and help the birthing women? Because really, birthing people, it doesn't work. Humanity doesn't continue if we don't get this right. And I want to just say, we're so fortunate to have had you today. I also want to just let our listeners know that we are collaborating together with the state of Colorado through your leadership, and we are going to do a pretty incredible mapping project, if I do say so myself, on the Where's My Midwife crowd map. Not only will we be mapping midwives, but also doulas, lawyers, and other birth support professionals who are available to help pregnant people as they go through these times. So we'll keep you all apprised of that, but that's going to be a really exciting project in the very near future.
Thank you. I'm so excited about that too. And it's really a part of this illustrating that this other health system already does exist, and that we are here resourcing each other, taking care of each other, listening to each other, finding the ways to help each other in spite of these systems that are not working for us. And I'm hoping that the more we can illustrate that and make it visible, in the awesome way that maps do, it will help funders see the value of investing in us, those of us who are already here, already doing it.
Do you guys know much about mycelium? Not just the psychedelic psilocybin, but mycelium. They're not sure where mushrooms came from, but they know that mycelium is what keeps our forests and our grasslands intact and thriving. And I feel like we, in this movement to make birth more just, more healthy, safer, more affordable, we are the mycelium. And we are unseen, but we are everything. So I'm really excited to see this work. And I agree with you, Indra. I do think mapping, showing that we're here and telling our stories, that will change society as we know it. It gives me hope. I'm only going to be 48 this year. I got another few decades in me. So why not?
To mycelium.
To mycelium. Thank you so much to the both of you for joining us today on Where's My Midwife, a podcast. We'll see you next time. Thank you, Indra Lusero and Kirsti Kreutzer. Have a great day.